This is becoming a really hard subject to talk about because it's the same story, it's the same thing, and that's really bad. The story is 103 Marines have been booted for refusing COVID vaccine as services begin discharges. Up to 30,000 service members remain unvaccinated and could face the same fate. I don't understand how we're supposed to be dealing with a crisis where the news changes every day and we have no idea what we're supposed to think or know. Dr. Fauci comes out and says, one thing one day, one thing the next day. We were told in some news reports that the vaccine, if you have 3 shots, will stop Omicron. Now we're hearing it actually won't, but you should still get it anyway. How is a Marine, a serviceman or woman, or the Marines in this instance, how are they supposed to know what to do? And the reason why I say this is becoming a really difficult subject to talk about is that it just keeps happening. We know there are problems. We know that the science we have, the data, hasn't been completely released. That's Pfizer wants to hold on to this data for decades, like several generations, actually. But everything keeps changing. What's worrying to me is this is the death by 1,000 cuts, I guess. I find myself looking at these stories and just being like, I don't want to do a segment on this. I don't care. It's the same thing. You've heard it before. You'll hear it again. And does that mean that this is the new normal? Yeah. And that's the problem with it. And that's why I ultimately decided that we should talk about this, or at the very least, I should do a segment on it, even though it's mind-numbingly boring to hear that this stuff keeps happening. It's exhausting. It feels like nothing's changing. It feels like it's not news. It's not relevant, but it is extremely relevant, especially as we're learning up to 30,000 service members remain unvaccinated and could face the same fate. I want to come back to the story because I think this one's the most important, but I think there's very important context to explain perhaps some of the attitudes of those who are not getting the vaccine, who are in the military or otherwise. This is a story we got just the other day. CDC panel to consider limits on use of J&J vaccine due to blood clot issues in some recipients. Now, I want to make sure I can break down some of the false framing that's been going around outside of, and on some websites. Some people have claimed they're recommending people not use it. Well, they're recommending over it. The CDC wants people to use to get the Moderna and Pfizer vaccine because there is a chance that the J&J vaccine can cause blood clots. I think that's very important context. It's very different from some of the articles that are like, just don't do it. No. They didn't say that. They didn't say that. But this story is important because many people have complained about the blood clot fears. It's been a recurring trend on the Donald Trump forums over at patriots.win. They call it the clot shot. And now we have, months later, the CDC saying these are issues that we're concerned about, so we're going to recommend the use of the other vaccines. Now, if you were to come out and make that joke or say call it the clot shot or whatever, you'd be banned in 2 seconds. How about now? I don't know. I'm not saying that. I always, they call me, Tim, talk to your Dr. Poole. There's a lot of things I think you should talk to other people about. I recently deleted a tweet because I felt like it sounded too much like financial advice. And I'm like, I just don't want to be responsible for anybody, man. I don't want to be in charge of anybody. I don't want anybody coming to me saying, you told me to do this, man. There's a few areas where I feel like I'm an expert enough on certain things where I can give advice. And that's just typically freedom. And that's why I often say that. Not science, not finance, but freedom. Stand up for your rights before you lose them. I got no problem saying that. And I got no problem telling people you could lose everything. You really, really could. These Marines are standing up for what they believe in, and they're going to be discharged. It'll be interesting. I think some people are saying they should be honorably discharged. I think it's an administrative discharge or a medical one, so it's not like it's all bad. But let me give you this context first, because I think for those that aren't familiar with what's going on, this might help you understand why there are people who are saying they are not going to get the vaccine. From timcast.com. An advisory panel at the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, is considering new restrictions or warnings on using the COVID vaccine from Johnson Johnson over fears the injections can cause blood clot issues in a small number of recipients. Quote, the single-dose vaccine has been linked to a rare and severe type of blood clot, which halted its use for about 10 days in April as federal health officials looked more closely at 6 women who experienced the problem. The only known cases among the more than 7 million people who received the vaccine in the U.S. at that time. One of the women died. The pause was lifted after an extensive safety review that determined the vaccine's benefit outweighed the risks. This is very important for people to understand. This is not a secret. The CDC has said this over and over again. They understand vaccines can have adverse events, adverse reactions. Sometimes people die. However, the way the CDC has explained it to me, like I actually sat down several years ago about Zika with one of the highest ranking dudes at the CDC, and we talked about these viruses and vaccines. And what he basically said was a lot of people don't trust vaccines because of the adverse events, because of the adverse reaction possibilities. However, they don't deny that's a reality. What they're saying is if the virus will kill, say, 100,000 people, but the vaccine will kill 1,000 people, then they think the vaccine is worth it. It's a utilitarian viewpoint. But you'll end up with a lot of people who are more individualist or have a more deontological view and feel that you cannot force, you can't take this action against an individual. And the individual has a right to choose. And therein lies a very real issue. A lot of people who view, they look at the COVID mortality rate and they say it's just not worth it. It's not worth taking any risks, no matter, just because the CDC says the benefits outweigh the risks doesn't mean an individual has to make that same choice. Now, I can't tell you because I'm not a doctor. You have different risk factors. That's why I oppose the mandates. There's two big reasons. One, I believe in freedom for the individual. And I also believe that someone who's 65 and overweight has a very different set of risk factors than someone who's 35 and fit. Now, I will tell you this. I genuinely believe had I not received monoclonal antibodies, I would have been in the ICU. And I'm not exaggerating. That's how bad this was. So I think y'all should take it seriously. That's what Joe told me to do. And the media likes to make fun of him because what he tells me to do is not to ignore it, man. Don't sit around. Go talk to somebody. Find somebody who's going to get you the treatment. Here's what he did. And I had a doctor out here say, this is the protocol we want to use. And I'm eternally grateful for all of that. I was in bad shape. I think y'all should take this one seriously. Not everybody's in bad shape. Some people don't even notice. Some people get the sniffles, but not me, man. And don't ask me. I don't know why. Some people have said it could be because Asian people have more ACE2 receptors. I know I'm not 100% Asian or whatever, but maybe that was a factor in why I got really sick. And that's, again, why I say you are not me. You do not have the same genetics as me, the same ACE2 receptors, none of that stuff. So I'm not going to tell you what you should be doing. And what people need to understand about these mandates, for Marines or otherwise, is that you as a collective force, as the public, as the people, as those voting, you are enforcing a medication on other people. It's the government. We say the government, but let's be real. The government is comprised of, for, and by the people. Now, I'll be the first to say elites are in control of it and have been for some long time. But there are people voting for this, putting their voting power, their monetary power, their political power behind forcing other people to get a medical treatment that might not be right for them. So I think you got to make the decision for yourself, like these Marines. ABC News reports 103 Marines have been discharged for refusing to take the COVID vaccine. The Marine Corps said Thursday, as military services have begun to discharge a pool of possibly as many as 30,000 active duty service members who still refuse to be vaccinated, even after multiple opportunities to do so past vaccination deadlines. In late August, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin ordered mandatory COVID vaccines for all U.S. military personnel. Shortly after Austin made the COVID vaccine mandatory, the military services quickly set up its own deadline dates and warned service members they could face discharge unless they were vaccinated, which is in line with the Pentagon's stance that choosing to remain unvaccinated is a violation of a lawful order from Austin. I believe that's not correct. There was a court ruling that said you can't mandate a vaccine that is not FDA approved. And there you go. I don't believe any of the vaccines are FDA approved. I know that Pfizer BioNTech's Comirnaty vaccine has been approved, but I don't believe the courts view that as, I believe they do view it as legally distinct. This is why I just tell you, man, you gotta talk to a medical professional, but you also need to make sure you know what you're looking into, what you're asking about. So the big controversy was that when the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine right now is under emergency use authorization, they got an FDA approval for their brand version, Comirnaty, which they say is functionally identical. However, there are differences. And because of that, I think, I don't have it pulled up, so you have to fact check this one. There was a judge who said, you can't mandate what's not FDA approved. So this is, I suppose, one of the issues here. They say while the percentage of vaccinated active duty personnel in each service is 95% or higher, the number of unvaccinated personnel is close to 30,000. Earlier this week, the Air Force became the first to make public that it had followed through on the warning announcing that 27 airmen had received administrative discharges. According to the latest numbers provided by the Air Force and the Navy, 7,365 airmen, 5,472 sailors are unvaccinated, either refusing the vaccine outright or awaiting the processing of requests for administrative, medical, or religious exemptions. I will say this. There's a lot of people have pointed this out. I've said this. When you join the military, whatever branch, you get a ton of vaccines. So the way it was told to me is that in basic training, they have you like walk up and then they give you a shot and then they wipe you down and then you walk forward again and then someone gives you a shot and they just give you all these different vaccines. Probably like yellow fever. It's probably like, typhus, a tetanus booster, all that stuff. However, in response to that, people pointed out that you can't mandate something that is not FDA approved, even the military. So this is where things get interesting. And and if that's the case, and we're in a really dangerous position here because people are being discharged over this. Their lives are being changed. And more importantly, media outlets and everything, all of this, they're just reporting to our adversaries that our armed forces is being crippled by people who are unwilling to undergo the vaccine and who are leaving. They're going to mention the Marine Corps said Thursday, 95% of its active duty force of 182,000 Marines have received at least one vaccine shot, the lowest percentage among the military services. The Marine Corps has approved 1,007 medical and administrative exemptions and is still processing 2,863 of the 3,144 requests. Military personnel serving in the United States had already been required to receive 12 vaccines, measles, polio, anthrax, chickenpox, flu, in order to serve. Service members assigned overseas were required to receive up to 5 others, like those for yellow fever or encephalitis, depending on the global region they were assigned to. While the Army announced Thursday that nearly 98% of its 478,000 active duty soldiers had been vaccinated, that means close to 10,000 soldiers are not. The Army said 3,864 soldiers have refused the vaccine outright, while an additional 6,263 are awaiting the processing of their requests for an exemption. The majority of service members who remain unvaccinated have sought religious exemptions, but none of the services have yet to approve an exemption on religious grounds. The Defense Authorization Bill passed by Congress this week guarantees that service members who are kicked out of the military for refusing the vaccine will receive either an honorable discharge or a general discharge under honorable conditions. Hey, good. That's on them. That's it. That's on the armed forces, man. So let me explain something. And most of you, I think, probably understand this, but for those maybe don't. Imagine you're in the armed forces, or let's say you're a nurse. Let's say you worked in the federal government. Let's say you worked at an airline. And they said, you must be vaccinated. And so you went to get your vaccine, and they said, Johnson & Johnson, one and done. And you said, okay. And you got that vaccine. There's 2 things to consider now that I think are worrying. One, that they're saying the efficacy of the vaccines has waned and now you'll need booster shots. That if you got the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, 2 months later, you need a booster shot. So many of these people who got vaccinated back in January, are they still cleared? At what point are they going to be like, doesn't count anymore? Now, more importantly, the CDC is considering, advisors will consider limits on the vaccine over blood clot issues. So look, it's a fact that there's no long-term studies on these vaccines. That is not to disparage them as vaccines. It's just to point out they're new. They were produced very quickly under Operation Warp Speed, and people have concerns about that. And now, about a year later, since we started seeing these vaccines roll out, just about a year, we're now learning that the definition of fully vaccinated is going to change. We're learning that they've issued some advisory. There's some concerns about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, that they're saying you should mix and match boosters and do all this other stuff. So how is that going to build confidence in someone who said, I'm going to wait and see, and now they see this? I don't know, man. But I can tell you more companies are starting to abandon this. From NBC News, growing number of companies suspend vaccine mandates, including hospitals and Amtrak. Facing a labor shortage, some healthcare systems and federal contractors are temporarily lifting the requirements. One physician called the move absurd. I'm sure he did. But Amtrak was faced with very serious disruptions of its service, and they said, if we implement this, we shut down train services, we delay trains, and everything is just disrupted. So can't do it. NBC says a growing number. We read that in the headline. The move follows court rulings in recent weeks that paused its requirements from the Biden administration for healthcare workers and federal contractors. Still, the decision about whether to require vaccination remained up to individual employers. The mandates are being suspended at a precarious time. Many employers face labor shortages while COVID cases are surging and the highly mutated Omicron variant is spreading. The highly mutated, oh heavens. Sufficient staffing has been hard to maintain in hospitals, which were already contending with a dearth of nurses and other workers before the pandemic. Burnout has further exacerbated shortages. One of the things that we've seen in the healthcare industry was that nurses were quitting, not because of the mandates, but because they said we could not handle it. ICUs are filling up. This is interesting to me. I wonder if the mortality rate would be much, much higher for COVID if we did not have these ICU beds. And honestly, I think the answer is yes. I think we underestimate how technology can change our view of a disease itself. One of the things people need to understand is that crime, people say that, violent crime is going down because murders are way down. And what people need to realize is that technically murders are way down, but it's because of cell phones. Attempted murders, I could be getting, it depends on where you are, but attempted murders are high. And violent crime has surged in the past year. Now, I think overall violent crime has been decreasing, but people need to understand that the reason the stats show a rapid decrease is because if someone gets attacked, someone else picks up their phone, their cell phone, right in their pocket and calls 911. Before the advent of cell phones, this wasn't the case. And if you were seriously injured in a fight or a mugging or something, you might die. You were more likely to. So what happens is people's lives get saved because of cell phones. No joke, because of cell phones. And then people look at the crime stats and say, wow, crime is down. And it's like, it might actually be just as dangerous as it's always been. But now you have a cell phone to help you to get the paramedics there in time if you're bleeding out or something. I think the same thing is true for any other illness. We have excellent hospitals and ICU beds. So people are getting sick with this disease and then they go to the hospital. This is why we wanted to slow the spread. Now, the problem here is across the board, none of that necessarily matters when you look at Florida. Florida's cases are the lowest in the country, and they have a very, very different protocol for this. So I certainly think that locking down everybody over fear of overloading the ICUs, I understand that for sure. But I think people should be looking to what Florida has been doing because they didn't lock down. And it may actually be that the lockdowns are making things worse. Can't believe we're still talking about this, and it's been almost 2 years. You know, when we, every night when we're getting ready for Timcast IRL, Luke, he'll come up and have a bunch of stories and I'll have a bunch of stories. And I've been avoiding a lot of the COVID stuff because it's redundant. It's repetitive. Been there, done that, heard it before. Oh, that's happening again? And so it's like protests, riots erupting in Europe and Australia. And I'm like, bro, we've covered those stories so much. Like, what more do we say about it? And the other issue, too, is Alec Baldwin. The Alec Baldwin story. Search warrant on his phone. And I'm like, we have talked about that story so much that it's just getting tiring talking about the same thing. But I will tell you two things. The reason why we were leading yesterday with the Alec Baldwin story is because I thought it was really important they were serving a search warrant on him. This one on IRL. Because what you need to understand is my view of the whole Alec Baldwin thing is that they did a crisis management, manipulated news to try and obfuscate and strike the story down. And now they're slow rolling out boring tidbits. And what's happening is eventually people are going to say, I don't care about this anymore. And then once that happens and they forget about it, Alec Baldwin walks. The same thing is true for what's going on with CDC and all this stuff. We can't let news burnout happen to us. We can't let these stories become normal. We have to make sure we're saying this is not what we accept. I think you, when you're seeking advice for how your life is going to be, should look to the experts in those fields. For me, it ain't finance and it ain't medical, but it is political. I can tell you, you got to stand up. You got to vote in your local elections. You got to vote in the primaries. You got to make sure that you are ignoring the haters telling you not to vote, that it's impossible. You just go and vote because it does matter. That's politics. I can tell you advice on that. I can tell you to stand up for yourself, and that may put you at great risk. But you need to recognize that too, that you have to have that responsibility. But man, I can tell you that when it comes to these mandates, we need to make sure that we're not going to let the new normal take over, especially at a time when we're dealing with this crisis in Ukraine. They would actually consider discharging Marines and up to 30,000 other service members. You know what? Then the United States deserves the collapse. Because if we're going to lose our armed forces to a great degree, if we're going to have an economic crisis, if people are going to be fired from their jobs, this country is falling apart. You know, I don't know how else to say it, and a lot of people don't like to hear it. But with the inflation, the wholesale pricing index at 10%, like I mentioned before, Max Kaiser saying he believes inflation's around 15. The consumer price index is nearly, 7? 7% over last year. Dude, your dollar's value is collapsing. People are being booted from the military. Cities are locking down like crazy. New York City just rapidly escalated their vax mandates. Now you need 2 shots. Now kids got to have them. There's videos of people standing outside of businesses with clipboards taking your IDs. People are letting this happen. And we know where this goes. Those that do not remember history are doomed to repeat it. We have seen this before, and I love it. When we talk about Weimar Germany or the Civil War, people say that'll never happen because they look at history and they see the worst of the worst. They don't realize that it took escalation to get to that point. Now, maybe we don't see the actual conflict in our lifetimes. It's 2021. There's a pandemic. No great world war just yet, but we are, as they say, in the fourth turning. People seem to think that when it comes to history, you wake up one day and there's a shot heard round the world. That someone made that move that everyone recognized was the start of some conflict. But that's never been the case. You know, in that article I was reading from Charles M. Blow, he references this dude 11 years before the Civil War who defended slavery and said people view him as the father of secession, even though, you know, he died 11 years before the Civil War. What is happening today will influence tomorrow. What happened yesterday will influence today. This is a fact. And if you think that where we are now, as we build the steps towards the edge of the cliff where we may jump off or we may avert it, what we are seeing throughout this country is bringing us in one direction, and that's calamity. But maybe it won't. Maybe we'll avert it somehow. I just don't see it. I do not see. Did you guys watch the Timcast IRL show last night? Did you watch the members only podcast? Things got hot. You know, I think we had R.A. the Rugged Man on. I think he's a really good dude. I do. And I think we have extreme disagreements on politics to the point where there's no reconciliation. And that's a fact. We hugged it out. I apologized. I felt bad for raising my voice to him, and I did. And he got heated, and he apologized too. He said I shouldn't have done that. And I take full responsibility for raising my voice and getting mad first. And then he stood up, and I don't even want to talk about it too much, but the point I want to make here is when we sit down, and I sit down with someone like him, and I say, here's my view, and here's the problem. He says, I don't care. He says, you are doing bad to what I believe. And then it results in us just getting to that point. If we can agree to disagree, if we can still hug it out, but in the end, there's no ideological reconciliation. That's what worries me. I'll give a little optimism there, though. You know, we in the member segment, I raised my voice, and he said, don't yell at me. And he says, because he was not the guy who was going to sit there and take it. And then I said, yeah, you are. You're that guy. And he got mad about it. I shouldn't have said that. And all these people on Twitter, man, they're putting up the clip saying what's happening and all that stuff. And I'm like, yeah, it happened. Yes, I uploaded it because I feel like I don't whitewash this stuff. But a lot of people aren't sharing the part where I said, I'm sorry for raising my voice, man. And he said, no, I'm sorry too. And then we hugged for a good 15, 20 seconds. And I just don't think racism is going away. I don't want to get heated with anybody. I don't want to fight with anybody. But I felt like after that conversation, I felt very pessimistic. With all due respect to Rugged Man, because we hugged it out. If he's going to tell me that he doesn't care about my experiences and the suffering that my family's been through, and my family literally fought in the civil rights era because he cares more about one race, I'm like, then racism is persistent and won't stop. We need to pay attention to that stuff. I'm not going to, maybe I'll do a bigger segment on all of that stuff, but I'll leave it there because this one's about the vaccine and where we're headed. Next segment's coming up at 1 p.m. on this channel. Thanks for hanging out, and I'll see you all then.